We had a little malfunction on the lecture today on the video, so I'm doing it in front of no audience, but you'll still get the information. We talked today briefly about the Emancipation Proclamation, and the point of the lecture was to let students know that in July of 1862, prior to the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln got his cabinet together and informed them that he was considering issuing a proclamation. And the proclamation that Lincoln was considering would be to free slaves in the states that had seceded from the Union, the Confederate States of America. On a side note, it didn't mention what would happen to the slaves in those 5 border states that we had talked about, including Maryland, where the Battle of Antietam was fought. Well, after a discussion with his cabinet in July of 1862, President Lincoln decided he would announce his proclamation to free the slaves in the Confederate States, but would only do so after a Union victory in the Civil War. Well, as you know from previous lectures, the Confederates were dominating in all battles in Virginia in the Eastern Theater, and Lincoln really needed a win at the Battle of Antietam, and he considered that battle enough of a win to announce his plans for the proclamation. So as a result, officially on January 1st of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued what we know in history as the Emancipation Proclamation. Now what this did, it was a presidential proclamation that officially ended slavery in the Confederate States. Now there were 2 reasons why Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and both might be kind of a surprise to you. The first one had to do with politics, because Lincoln was a Republican, and within the Congress there were radical Republicans that really thought that Lincoln was being too soft on the Confederates. Lincoln was getting tired of their continual badgering and their second guessing and criticism, so he thought by freeing the slaves in the Confederate States it would appease those radical Republicans where they would settle down a little bit and leave him alone. Secondly, the second reason why he issued the Emancipation Proclamation is to keep France and Britain out of the war on the side of the South. Now remember, we talked about the Confederate States of America when they first established themselves, negotiating with both France and Great Britain for aid in the Civil War, and their carrot that they were going to give these 2 foreign countries, so to speak, was this cotton that both foreign countries needed desperately. Well, there was no question that both France and Great Britain were willing to help the South concerning the issue of states' rights. But if you figure on this, when Lincoln issued this Emancipation Proclamation, all those southern states didn't say, oh great, we know that Lincoln's in charge, and they didn't release all their slaves. They still wanted those slaves, and a lot were kept forcibly in the South. Matter of fact, most of them were, because they needed not only the slave labor on their plantations, but as is mentioned in the video that we watched on the Battle of Antietam, a lot of these slaves were being forced to serve in the Confederate Army. So they didn't free them. So now it became clear that the South wasn't only fighting for states' rights in their battle against the Union, but they were also fighting to maintain slavery. Well, neither France nor Great Britain were going to support a fight for slavery, so really this Emancipation Proclamation was absolutely brilliant on the part of Abraham Lincoln. Now, another side note is after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, approximately 180,000 blacks fought on the Union side in the Civil War. Some of those were from the North that were already free men, and some of them were from the South that were able to get away from their masters and plantations in the South and get into northern soil. They also bore arms against the Confederacy. Now, if you think about that, why would northern Negroes or former slaves fight on the side of the Union? Because of they were so impressed with President Lincoln in freeing their brothers, or their family that was left back in the South were now free, and they appreciated Lincoln's efforts here and were willing to join. Now, we still haven't got through this even today in some fashions, but these black soldiers obviously were not integrated in with white soldiers. They were segregated into the United States colored troops and were often referred to, these Negro soldiers, as Buffalo Soldiers. Now again, the United States government did not have confidence that black men could lead themselves or command themselves, So these buffalo soldiers and these segregated troops were commanded by white officers. Now, you can imagine if you were a Negro former slave or a free slave fighting on the side of the Union, if the Confederates would happen to capture you in battle. They didn't follow the prisoners of war rules. They simply either shot those former slaves or Negroes, or they burned them to death immediately. Wasn't much different for white officers who commanded black troops. Confederates despised those as bad or worse than the slaves that turned against them, and they were often given the same treatment. So that ends the Emancipation Proclamation, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Battle of Fredericksburg tomorrow. And prior to the Battle of Fredericksburg, President Lincoln again makes a change in overall commander of Union forces, replacing General McClellan, who he actually gave 2 opportunities to, and he replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside. Now, the Union plan under General Burnside is not going to be any different than we talked about before. The idea is for the Union to march down to Richmond, defeat the Confederate Army in a major battle near Richmond, capture Richmond, and end the Civil War. So the lecture will pick up tomorrow with the Battle of Fredericksburg and continue throughout the surrender at Appomattox later in the Civil War. Okay, here are the notes. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but here you go.